This is from the website thewaythetruthandthelife.net.
Question: are American-made, genetically modified Nephilim soldiers fighting in Syria?
Dear friends, I am so displeased about Rick Wiles being distracted from the truth by an attention-getting conspiracy theory. I was so glad to hear Rick Wiles say the truth about the Syrian involvement of Russia saving Christians. I was so pleased I produced a YouTube video on the subject and posted it. I'll put a link below for that. Well, Saudi Arabia, Israel, USA, and others are funding Muslims following the Koran, Surah 8. I read from verse 12. When the Lord revealed, that's Allah, revealed to the angels, I am with you. Therefore, make firm those who believe, that is, believe in Muhammad and the Quran. I will cast terror into the hearts of those who disbelieve. Therefore, strike off their heads, strike off their fingertips of them. Verse 13. This is because they acted adversely to Allah and His apostle. And whoever acts adversely to Allah and His apostle, then surely Allah is severe in requiting the evil. This, taste it and know that for the unbelievers is the chastisement of fire. So that's what the book of a murder cult teaches. And Rick Wiles is touching on Islam, but understands that the true Muslims have turned against the corrupt royal families that were set up there by England. And the prince went and got Trump, and after going to Israel, they're working together. The royals are scared to death of the fundamentalists, the Islamic State are fundamentalists that they thought would attack Iran. A quick background here. The Turks are Sunni, but their own variety. The Persians, that's Iranians, are Shiite. And the Arabs are Sunni. But the Arabs at the top are corrupted with all the oil money and the royalty set up by England. And many of the royal emirates and so forth have even a majority Shiite, and they would like democracy. That was the one of the main reasons for the Gulf Wars, was to protect them and put down rebellions there. But Saudi royalty had the chief imam of Shiite beheaded, and they're ready to attack Iran is ready to attack the royal families for their evil. But they thought that the Arab part of Iraq, if America left the weapons, that the Arab part of Iraq got those weapons, they would turn against Iran, which there was a war, millions killed in a war between Iraq and Iran back in, I think, the 70s. But they've been played against one another by Israel and the royalty. But so here, the common enemy of Israel and the upper class, rich, wealthy, corrupted Arabs is Iran. And now the Salafists. They gave the Salafists, the strict Sunni Muslims, the weapons in Iraq and thought they would go against the Shiites, and instead they turned against the corrupt Saudi royalty and upper class, the evil that they're doing. to a Muslim, it's like a Christian. They don't want to see the adultery and fornication and homosexual marriage and abortion. So there are some things in common with the values of wanting responsible homes. But it ends there when it comes to the love that Christ brought and separating us from the priesthood, that we can have a direct relationship with our source of existence. But that's just the background. Israel is working with the royal Saudi Muslims that have control of who's an imam in the Sunni. They set up madrasas all over Pakistan. That's where the fundamentalists are coming from. But the fundamentalists that were set up by the royalty have turned against them. But that's background. Okay, let's get on with it. Every group uses the religion or murder cult to justify their own murder. Turkey murders non-Turks. Iranians murder those that won't submit to their idea of Islam, and the Arabs, Sunnis, they're Salafists, and they attack the Sunnis, and it's a mess of evil that has a pre-religious foundation of genetic hatred for domination, and that's just a simple thing. What makes babies makes the genetics, and it's an alpha male that beats up the boys and rapes the girls that made babies, and it's the pretty little girls that went out and dancing around half naked, not knowing, but that's what got them pregnant. So those are genetic traits. Watch the young girls walk around, and watch the young men play bully if they've gone through a healthy foundation. Again, the development of children, if they have a mother that can give them a good breastfeeding and care, they are very narcissistic, selfish. They go, and you care for them and give them the love and care that they need and carry them around with you. They bouncing like they were when they were in their mother, and they see the world, and that's when the nerve growth factor is present and their brain develops. If you don't do that, you're generating the potential of autism. At any rate, with that, my uncle raised mink, and one thing that mammalian herd raisers know, you choose the mothers well. The other ones you use for fur or meat or whatever, and you use their litters. But the good mothers, you keep them, and you keep their female that were raised by them, because they are able to be good mothers. It isn't a matter of logically, I want to be a good mother for some young woman. If she was dumped in daycare too soon, she's not able to make that bond, and it's a tragedy for her too. But at any rate, getting back to this stuff with Rick Wiles, he's gotten distracted. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about there now.
Question. Are American-made, genetically modified Nephilim soldiers fighting in Syria? Stay tuned. We're going to talk about it on today's edition of True News.
The truth is, there is a warrior genetics in men, not from some outer space Nephilim. It's by God's law of genetics. What survives to make babies makes the genetics of the future. Now, of course, there's another important part to that. Jane Goodall discovered, besides the alpha male dominating, the boys and girls were out in the woods having sex for fun. So that's a genetic thing, too. The narcissism and the anarchism is a genetically founded thing that's in conflict with the submission to dominant male. And it has there's a conflict of love and hate there And naturally, those who didn't get the foundation to go from narcissistic to homoerotic, boys like boys and girls like girls, if they have a foundation when their genes hit, they then are interested in the opposite sex. But many don't have the foundation to go to that. But when they hit the opposite sex and those genes are there, that's when it's a strong supporter for the dominant male to go out there and make babies and fight. But many are in the homoerotic, homosexual stage, and they don't get to that, and they have a hatred and resentment for the dominant male, both male and female. It's the source of anarchism, but let's get on with it.
Well, my friends, the world is on the verge of a third world war, and it will have nuclear weapons. The flashpoint is Syria. If war erupts, there is a high likelihood that Damascus will be destroyed. I want to remind the Christian Zionists who are eagerly waiting for this to happen that 2.5 million Christians live in Syria. Hundreds of thousands of Christians dwell in the city of Damascus and nearby suburbs and towns. The Syrian Christians trace their heritage to the apostles Peter and Paul. The Orthodox Church of Antioch is the largest denomination. Other Christian denominations in Syria include the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Assyrian Church of the East, and the Chaldean Catholic Church. American news media outlets and politicians are telling us that Syria is in the middle of a civil war. Well, there is no civil war in Syria. Syria was invaded by an army of jihadists, recruited, trained, and armed by the United States, Great Britain, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. The purpose has always been to overthrow President Assad so that Syria could be carved up and given away in chunks to other nations. The result is that over 500,000 Syrians have been killed. Another 5 million are refugees fleeing from the violence that the West sent to their homeland. As an American, I am ashamed of what my country has done to the Syrian people. As a Christian, I grieve for my brethren who have suffered through so much death and destruction caused by greedy, evil men and women in our country and other Western nations. I continue to pray for peace. As of today, there appears to be a lull in the buildup of war fever. Reports coming from Washington indicate that Secretary of Defense James Mattis is battling with National Security Advisor John Bolton over plans for war. Mr. Bolton wants war. Mr. Mattis is warning it will spin out of control and result in war with Russia. I ask all Christians to pray for peace.
And look at this. Trump sold out to his Jewish son-in-law's interest in Israel and the Saudi prince. And we're buying and paying for weapons to murder people in Yemen. Watch this.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's a great honor to have the Crown Prince with us. Saudi Arabia has been a very great friend and a big purchaser of equipment and lots of other things. And one of the biggest investments in the United States is I guess it's your big investment, is buying stock in companies and various other things in the United States and creating jobs. We've become very good friends over a fairly short period of time. I was in Saudi Arabia in May, and we are bringing back hundreds of billions of dollars into the United States, and we understand that, and they understand that. Some of the things that have been approved and are currently under construction and will be delivered to Saudi Arabia very soon, and that's for their protection. But if you look in terms of dollars, $3 billion, $533 million, $525 million. That's peanuts for you. Should have increased it. $880 million, $645 million, $6 billion. That's for frigates. $889 million, $63 million, and that's for various artillery. Some of the things that we're now working on, thanks, and that have been ordered and will shortly be started in construction and delivered. THAAD system, $13 billion. The C-130 airplanes, the Hercules, great plane, $3.8 billion. The Bradley vehicles, that's the tanks, $1.2 billion. And the P-8 Poseidons, $1.4 billion. And what it does is it really means many, many jobs. We're talking about over 40,000 jobs in the United States. So we make the best equipment in the world. There's nobody even close. And Saudi Arabia is buying a lot of this equipment and
using it in places like Yemen to bomb and murder people to try to bring them into submission.
Burkhardt and Edward Zoll are here. Guys, glad to have you back. There does appear to be, going by the reports that we're getting out of Washington, there's conflict between Secretary Mattis, a Marine general, and John Bolton. John Bolton is the war hawk. He wants war. He's known for his feverish support of Israel, and he wants war. But Secretary Mattis is warning President Trump, this is going to spin out of control. We're going to go to war with Russia.
Because Mad Dog Mattis, General Mattis, has seen what war looks like.
He knows what it looks like.
He's seen body bags.
That's right. We need to pray that Secretary Mattis has the upper hand in the White House right now. Yes. And that God gives him favor.
Yes.
And that calm, cool-minded people prevail in the White House, and that hot-headed people who want war and bloodshed, like John Bolton, are pushed aside, and that their advice is not listened to, or we're going to have a horrific mess on our hands any day.
We do have a mess on our hands, and it's not new. Violence is part of our heritage that people like Abraham and Moses confronted the evil of human nature, the genetics of what makes babies, and that's the strong alpha male and the manipulative female who entertains the invader. But first, let's look at the history of violence.
Images like this from the Auschwitz concentration camp have been seared into our consciousness during the 20th century and have given us a new understanding of who we are, where we've come from, and the times we live in. During the 20th century, we witnessed the atrocities of Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Pol Pot, Rwanda, and other genocides. And even though the 21st century is only 7 years old, we have already witnessed an ongoing genocide in Darfur and the daily horrors of Iraq. This has led to a common understanding of our situation, namely that modernity has brought us terrible violence, and perhaps that native peoples lived in a state of harmony that we have departed from to our peril. Here's an example from an op-ed on Thanksgiving in the Boston Globe a couple of years ago, where the writer wrote, "The Indian life was a difficult one, but there was no employment problems, community harmony was strong, substance abuse unknown, crime nearly non-existent. What warfare there was between tribes was largely ritualistic and seldom resulted in indiscriminate or wholesale slaughter." Now, you're all familiar with this treacle. We teach it to our children. We hear it on television and in storybooks. Now, the original title of this session was "Everything You Know is Wrong," and I'm going to present evidence that this particular part of our common understanding is wrong. that in fact our ancestors were far more violent than we are, that violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and that today we are probably living in the most peaceful time in our species' existence. Now, in the decade of Darfur and Iraq, a statement like that might seem somewhere between hallucinatory and obscene, but I'm going to try to convince you that that is the correct picture. The decline of violence is a fractal phenomenon. You can see it over millennia, over centuries, over decades, and over years, although there seems to have been a tipping point at the onset of the Age of Reason in the 16th century. One sees it all over the world, although not homogeneously. It's especially evident in the West, beginning with England and Holland around the time of the Enlightenment. Let me take you on a journey from several powers of 10 from the millennium scale to the year scale to try to persuade you of this. Until 10,000 years ago, all humans lived as hunter-gatherers without permanent settlements or government. And this is the state that's commonly thought to be one of primordial harmony. But the archaeologist Lawrence Keeley, looking at casualty rates among contemporary hunter-gatherers, namely, which is our best source of evidence about this way of life, has shown a rather different conclusion. Here's a graph that he put together showing the percentage of male deaths due to warfare in a number of foraging or hunting and gathering societies. The red bars correspond to the likelihood that a man will die at the hands of another man, as opposed to passing away of natural causes, in a variety of foraging societies in the New Guinea highlands and the Amazon rainforest. And they range from a rate of almost a 60% chance that a man will die at the hands of another man to, in the case of the Gabuski, only a 15% chance. The tiny little blue bar in the lower left-hand corner plots the corresponding statistic from the United States and Europe in the 20th century, and it includes all the deaths of both world wars. If the death rate in tribal warfare had prevailed during the 20th century, there would have been 2 billion deaths rather than 100 million. Also on the millennium scale, we can look at the way of life of early civilizations, such as the ones described in the Bible. And in this supposed source of our moral values, one can read descriptions of what was expected in warfare, such as the following from Numbers 31. And they warred against the Midianites as the Lord commanded Moses, and they slew all the males. And Moses said unto them, Have you saved all the women alive? Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that hath known man by lying with him, but all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. In other words, kill the men, kill the children. If you see any virgins, then you can keep them alive so that you can rape them. And you can find 4 or 5 passages in the Bible of this ilk.
This is important because this is where Muhammad learned, the people of the book. Muhammad was a camel caravan driver and took caravans across the desert where they would stop overnight. And the Jewish merchants were some of the main customers. And they would tell the stories from the Torah that the Jewish young men had to memorize. So they had these stories to tell. And the Arab was a memorization storytelling society too. But this is one of the stories about Moses after he had done the wonderful thing of having the 10 commandments that even kings and pharaohs were to be executed if they murdered somebody. But then, according to this in Deuteronomy, which some claim was written later on to justify the Jewish actions, but they claims that Moses sanctioned exterminating a whole people. But in 2 places I will cite for you that the Bible says to exterminate. After Moses, the next one I'm aware of is Joshua, who followed him. And in chapter 6, verses 16 to 20, it talks about exterminating the people of Jericho, all except for the prostitute that two of their spies had been protected by. And the Joshua's order was to destroy all, except the people of the prostitute's family that were in her home. And to take no animals or anything, just the gold and silver and brass and iron for the Lord's treasury. That's the first example after Moses. And there's one more example. This example you can read in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not. Slay both men, women, infants, suckling, ox, sheep, camel, and ass. That's what's written in the Jewish Bible to justify exterminating the people who are occupying the land that they wanted. And Muhammad was told these stories. And then he was told about Jesus. But he decided Jesus was just another prophet. His stuff about love everybody there was something better. You needed to make a world government that all people would submit to the same God, not the Jews with their special God and being special people, but the one God, Allah, and all would have to submit or be exterminated. But so that's where it comes from. I'm not trying in any way to demean what a wonderful thing that Abraham founded a culture that didn't sacrifice children. And part of the reason was some of the Jewish exterminations were that they were tribes that attacked others, and they sacrificed their children to Moloch. They dumped them into the fire while the priest played the drums so you wouldn't hear the baby crying. But that's what it talks in the Bible about. The Jews got corrupted again and joined these false religions, making their children pass through the fire. That is, pass to their eternal ground by being burned to death as a sacrifice for Moloch. But at any rate, let's go on with this concern with Rick Wiles.
I want to go back briefly to what I said in my open. Christian Zionists are proclaiming President Trump to be Cyrus the Great. Now, we've heard this ever since he went in the White House for over a year.
That's right. This is a, quote, coin, unquote, head of the Mikdash Educational Center, Rabbi Mordecai Persos, holds a coin they minted bearing President Donald Trump's image to honor his recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital in Tel Aviv, Israel, Wednesday, February the 28th. The center said Wednesday that the temple coin features Trump alongside King Cyrus, who 2,500 years ago allowed Jews to return to Jerusalem from their exile in Babylon. There's a picture of the piece.
I believe that God did bring Donald Trump along, President Trump along.
I did
too. But not for the purpose to start World War III.
That's right.
But to give an opportunity for this nation to return to God. And we still haven't returned to God. We're still living like as in the days of Noah, living fragrantly in our sin.
And it's not President Trump's responsibility to lead America to God. He's got to get himself to God. He's got to get his own life cleaned up. He was put there to stop the plans of very evil, wicked people from being fulfilled.
Yes.
Trump can serve the outlook of a healthy society like Jesus came, where he said we don't have to go to the priest, we go to our source of existence. But here we are with, on one side, a whole bunch of different factions of a murder cult and the what do you call the Hindus, what they're born to dominate other people, the caste societies. Another thing that the Muslims learned from the Jews was memorization and indoctrination, that you have robots with no individual sovereignty potential. Watch. And then you've got the Saudi-sponsored madrasas all over the world where they're teaching the young boys to memorize this book that says to murder those who don't submit to your religion, your murder cult. And on the other side, you have the murder cult of go have fun having unprotected sex and then murder the baby, but we'll make it legal because we have the power of the dictatorship of the majority. Trump might be able to help in these things if he could wake up. But the reality is there's evil on both sides, and we do need warriors to fight this evil on both sides. It's so hard when it's your school teachers teaching elementary school about accepting homosexual marriage, and Johnny has two fathers or two mothers or whatever, and that's what they're teaching children. And the permissiveness of sex, unprotected sex, sex out of marriage, homosexual sex, and there's some even advocating, oh, if children agree, it's okay, and then animals, you can't prosecute that. What's the matter with you? Let people alone. The anarchist stuff. But Trump could stand against it. And there is a nice quote in Psalm 144. Now I'll read that to you. Here's Psalm 144, verses 1 and 2. Blessed be the Lord, my strength, which teacheth my hands to war, and my fingers to fight, my goodness and my fortress, my high tower, and my deliverer, my shield, he in whom I trust, who subdueth my people under me. Well, and it speaks of the Lord will come with a sword. The Lord is that healthy spirit. My Lord is reality, in whom I live and move and have my being. And people who are serving civilization, not anarchist, abortionist, or memorizing stuff. Do you know that there's a whole bunch of Jewish that are against Israel?
But in New York, there's a group of ultra-Orthodox Jews who are devoted to the Palestinian struggle. And as Marina Portnaya discovered, they believe an end to the state of Israel is the only solution.
Every rally,
free Palestine!
Every demonstration,
Long-live Palestine!
every opportunity to voice opposition.
Judaism, yes! Zionism, no! The state of Israel must go!
A particular chorus of Orthodox Jews joins forces with the loud choir of Palestinian supporters.
Free Palestine! Free Palestine!
The collective voice is otherwise known as Netori Karta, ultra-traditional Jews religiously opposed to the creation and existence of Israel.
It is like a tumor to us. It has latched itself onto us, this terrible, evil movement of Zionism, which is the ideology behind the state of Israel, and it has hijacked and stolen the Star of David.
According to Rabbi Rick Wiles, Jews were exiled from the land of Israel because of their sins. Netori Karta worshippers believe restoration of the land should only happen with the coming of the Messiah. Until then,
we are forbidden as Jews to have any sovereignty, even in an uninhabited land.
According to Netori Karta, Israel and Zionism are in direct conflict with the Torah. They campaign for Israel to be dismantled and the Holy Land returned to Arabs who originally occupied it. Rabbi David Feldman says activism plays a strong role in the religious life of Netori Karta Jews, and this includes meeting with leaders of Muslim countries.
They have no problem with Jews as Jews. They can live, they can tolerate Jews, they can live with Jews, and they can host Jews with the greatest respect. They do have a serious problem with occupation, which we happen to agree with.
An agreement that has raised eyebrows. Members of Netori Karta have spoken several times with Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who they call a peace-loving leader. They've publicly praised Turkish officials and even traveled to the country last year, visiting injured activists following the Israeli raid on the Gaza flotilla. Very often, overseas demonstrations against Israel have turned violent. From London and Montreal to the Middle East, a bloody and bruising backlash has transpired. Critics have classified Netori Karta Jews as extremists, and Israel supporters deem them as traitors. Even here in New York City.
You're embarrassing Judaism. You're a piece of shit. With your black jacket, with your lost girl.
Rabbi Weiss is familiar with the dangers that surround Netori Karta.
We must be ready to give our lives to this. It's not easy.
A life devoted to their faith, even if it means facing contempt every step of the way. Marina Portnaya, RT, New York.
A lot of people don't know that the Jews and the Muslims worked together for hundreds of years. When the Muslims ruled Spain, their rent collectors and bookkeepers were the Jews. It was a wonderful period for the Jews under the Muslims in Spain. That's why they had the Inquisition, because the Jews weren't the ones getting their heads cut off and their fingers cut off under the Muslims. They were serving the Muslims and even carried weapons. But when they overthrew Israel to set up the new Israel, then the Muslims turned against the Jews, and Jews all over the Middle East lost their fine standing in the Islamic world. There were hundreds of thousands of Jews in Turkey from those who had been rescued from Spain when the Christians took the land back. And I can show you something about that. But another thing people don't know, when the Christians took that back, what used to be a home church culture, the Goths had morphed into the Visigoths, the warlords, the Ump-de-Umps, were attracted to the worldly recognition of the Pope and became Catholic. And they participated in this Inquisition, where they went to attack the Jews and Muslims who had been murdering and subjugating Christians and making their so many virgin daughters for the harems in North Africa. Read about it. At any rate, you want to know why there's such a problem with the Hispanics? The Visigoth culture that conquered Spain back from the Muslims, they had been under Muslim control for 700 years with that culture, that the top people could dominate, men could have as many wives as they wanted, and they were in control. And so the warlords, the Visigoth warlords, set themselves up like the Muslims. They could have as many women as they wanted. You could read some about that with the popes even, but that's another thing. So here they are, and to keep their wealth and power, their eldest son is the one who inherits the property and the title. The other sons became military officers and priests, and where did they go? The conquistadors. Spain conquered the world with this Muslim culture under a Catholic name, and that's what's in South America. I was in Paraguay. My friend, a professor of physics there, living behind a wall. They had servants, and they have to live behind a wall with glass so the poor people can't climb over. And here's the wealthy upper class, like Muslims. They only have one legal marriage, but they got women all over. It's a Muslim culture with a Christian name. Look at the beheading. Where do you think the beheading in Mexico come from? That was a Muslim culture that the conquistadors brought to Latin America. Wake up. It's an evil culture that can go on because it appeals to the alpha male stuff. At any rate, let me get on with it. I'm going to stop this and show you.
It wasn't time out, a reprieve for America. It was for the church.
Yes.
For the church to get its act together, to start praying and preaching and proclaiming righteousness and holiness.
But we see none of these leaders saying that to his ear, do we?
No, they're not saying to him, you have to stop abortion. You have to stop same-sex marriage. You have to stop pornography. They're saying you have to build the third temple in Israel.
Right. You
got to crush Syria. That's what they're saying to him. We have American Christian leaders telling the President of the United States he's got to go to war.
It just boggles the mind.
It is. Be careful what you ask for. Be careful what you pray for, because you will get it. As I've said before, God will not be mocked. All right, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap.
Don't misunderstand. I don't think it's going to happen. The dictatorship of the majority is just degrading to the bottom. It's going to end up self-destructive. And once the conflict and war breaks out to the point you don't have electricity, when the electric goes out, then cities are going to be starving. People will be eating people. This type of environment will bring a benevolent dictator, and I pray that there's enough knowledge of reality that the home is rebuilt on Christian values. What I would pray for is that Christian part of Canada and America and Europe could work together with the Christian part of Russia. Russia is rescuing Christians, making it safe for Christians. And there are some Muslims that Christians have been protected in Syria since the original founding of the church there. It's this radicalization of Muslims taking over, and that they are reading the Koran, and it says to do that, to establish a world caliphate. So, at any rate, let's go on with the distraction that Rick Wiles has here.
But we were talking about recent references by Russian officials, well, Syrian officials, about genetically modified soldiers fighting in Syria. And we got a lot of comments from viewers yesterday who thought maybe we lost our minds.
But this was from the Syrian ambassador himself.
We played the clips. You heard him say it.
We just reported. We don't make it up. We just reported. Twice he referred to genetically modified entities fighting in Syria. He wasn't talking about genetically modified food. He was talking about soldiers, okay?
Frankenfighters.
Yeah, Frankenfighters.
I want to disagree and say that to me this is nonsense. In God we live and move and have our being. The reality is survival of the fittest, and the dominant male that could group and work together with other males to dominate and kill the other men and take their women were the ones that made babies. So that is a genetic thing. You can degrade men all you want, but they have the ability to fight, to be angry enough to be killed or kill or be killed, to go into war. And that's genetic. And it can be for good or evil. If you're, and the thing is, how do you destroy the destroyer? Here, Muslims have been killing the Buddhist monks. Take one there, took him into a mosque and tortured him with fire and cut off his testicles and then took him out. And they've been rebelling as they've gotten enough. And the killing, coming out of the mosque after Friday prayers, killing people wherever they can find them with swords. The same way they did with the Miss Universe pageant in Nigeria back around 2001. Look it up. At any rate, what's happening in Myanmar and the Buddhists who have a Christ-like foundation of peace. They're fighting back against the Muslim evil murder cult, and they are called the evil people because they're fighting against the evil. How do you destroy a destroyer? So here's this genetic part, especially of men. The hate is in women. That's a hate against men because men have been violently raping them since before they were genetically evolved. The same thing for dogs and cats and rabbits. But they don't know the baby come from the rape, so they care for their babies. That's the difference between lower mammals and humans, the way the humans treat mothers. Can kill their babies, no problem. The Muslims try to protect children. They don't allow abortion. They don't want birth control. They want a high birth rate to dominate the world like the Catholics did. In Pakistan, one of the large not-for-profit charities is out of respect for the dead babies going around and picking them up out of the garbage. They can't have abortion, so they just kill their babies and dump them in the garbage. And women are harder to deal with in a Muslim culture. 9 out of 10 of the dead babies in the garbage are female. I'll show you that.
Babies abandoned and left to die in the middle of rubbish in Karachi. Their parents would have faced up to 7 years imprisonment if they had been caught, but that hardly ever happens. Volunteers from the Eddie Foundation recovered the 2 bodies in the middle of the rubbish. It is a sad routine for Mohammed, who's been driving Eddie's ambulances for 25 years.
I've collected too many bodies. I can't even count them. Each time it's difficult, but once it was particularly painful. I went to pick up 2 babies, 2 girls in a rubbish dump. They had been eaten by dogs. Their small bodies were completely mutilated.
In this conservative Muslim country, the birth of children outside of marriage is condemned, and adultery is a crime punishable by death under strict interpretations of Islamic law. Infanticide is a crime on the rise. The association recovered more than 1,000 babies from rubbish dumps last year. Some are illegitimate children, handicapped, or simply born to poverty-stricken families. And statistics are frightening. 9 times out of 10 they are girls.
Poor people abandon their daughters as they think that they'll be a liability in the future. Economic conditions are getting worse and a family needs at least $1 million rupees to get a girl married off.
That's almost $12,000, and the cost of a wedding can simply be crippling for poor families. Abortion is forbidden in Pakistan, so to give parents an alternative, Eddie has installed 400 cribs across the country, and every year around 200 babies are left in them. They are then taken to this orphanage to await adoption. It usually doesn't take very long to find them a new home.
We currently have 12,000 adoption requests. Some couples have been waiting for 5 years, so we have to select the best parents. We ask them to own their house, to have the financial capability to bring up a child, and be married for 10 years.
These girls will get a second chance in life. But the country has been in the grip of a serious economic crisis for years, and poverty is spreading. Despite the Foundation's efforts, many more young lives are likely to come to a brutal end.
Yeah, so we've got a video of President Putin making a reference. He was talking to students. This is October 23rd, 2017. Watch this and then we'll talk about it.
Это представить, даже не очень теоретически, а уже можно практически представить, что человек может создавать человека с заданными характеристиками. Это может быть гениальный математик, это может быть гениальный музыкант, но может быть и военный, человек, который может воевать без страха и без чувства сострадания, сожаления и без боли. То есть, вы понимаете, человечество может вступить, и, скорее всего, вступит в ближайшее время, в очень сложный и очень ответственный период своего развития и существования. И вот то, о чем я сейчас сказал, может быть страшнее ядерной бомбы.
Doc, what does Vladimir Putin know?
He knows something's going on. I mean, he really does. That there are efforts now being made to create new kinds of life, in this case, super soldiers.
And he used the words, will be more destructive than nuclear bombs. What do nuclear bombs do? They destroy entire swaths of an entire country wherever they get hit and used.
All right, so Edward, we were talking yesterday about, all right, is it conceivable that the U.S. has released into Syria genetically modified super soldiers? And we had touched on the topic that, you know, when ISIS was introduced to the world, nobody had ever heard of ISIS.
Right.
And we were shocked by their barbaric behavior.
Yes.
I mean, cut children in half with swords, decapitated people.
Burn people alive in
Burn
cages.
them alive in cages, impaled pastors on their crosses in their church. All right. We were shocked, horrified by the bloody, savage behavior of these people. And I woke up this morning thinking about, wait a minute. Vladimir Putin accused the West several years ago of supporting savages that eat human organs.
Yes.
Now, we're not going to show you the video. It's too gruesome. It's several years old. I'm going to show you just a still image of what he was talking about. That is an ISIS fighter. There's a Syrian soldier on the ground that he had just killed. And in the video, this ISIS soldier takes his knife, opens up the soldier's chest, removes his heart and his liver, and eats it.
Yes.
And Vladimir Putin accused David Cameron to his face.
Yes.
The Prime Minister of Great Britain, he said, you support these savages that eat human organs.
Yes.
I would simply say, don't be so ignorant. The Iroquois Indians who had been enslaved up in Quebec when they gained freedom, that Iroquois would cannibalize the people they killed. They would torture them too. It was part of their culture. But like the priests, the one tribe around Niagara Falls had converted to Christianity, the Neuter tribe, and the Iroquois exterminated them, killed them all, and took those priests and cut meat off their bones as they were burned, put them up, tied up, and lit fire under their legs. And they cut the lips and tongue off from one who kept preaching Jesus. There's nothing new about this vulgarity. The Turkmen murdered all the way across. Once the horses were domesticated, they could run across Tartars, and the word slave came from Slavs, from all of the Russian Slavs that were enslaved. Well, they killed, 1.5 million of the men and took 1.5 million of the women and sold them into slavery to their brother, the Muslim Turks. Read about it. All across the Mediterranean were slaves. They were from the word Slav, sold into slavery by the people that now get such sympathy because after helping the Nazis in Ukraine and Crimea, they were deported. They didn't kill them. The communists didn't kill the traitorous Muslims, Turkmen. They deported them. And then they come back after the end of the communist rule, and they're the poor victims. At any rate, this is nothing new. And did you know that there were always these fighting men? Especially one of the biggest names associated with them is called Vikings. They dominated wherever they went, and the Muslims in parts of Portugal could never defeat them. But they were so honorable. They come down and conquered Russia, and they were so honorable. They had a ruler there before they converted to Christianity. That he was so good and fair, and then they immigrated back out of Russia, and the Russian lords invited them back to rule over, because the Russian lords were having so much conflict, and the Vikings were honorable. Then the Byzantine Empire invited these non-Christian fighters. They were so honorable and fierce, they invited them in to help after they had become affluent, and invited Muslims in for their help and didn't know that it was the invitation to a murder cult. And the Christians that was the land of the seven churches. They're all dead now. That's Turkey today. At any rate, let's get on with it.
Now, Mr. Putin has known for some time that we're doing something in Syria that nobody has ever seen before. Is it conceivable that we have bred soulless creatures, soldiers without a soul, with no remorse, no conscience,
no fear?
No fear. You can go in, you can cut a baby in half. You can cut out the hearts of Christians and eat them. There's no conscience, no fear. There's no fear of God. Is that what we have created? Have we turned these monsters loose in Syria?
I'm sorry, but you've got that wrong. Some of these fierce monster good fighters love the Lord and are very respectful of the honor that the Kurds have been showing in rescuing Christians and Alawites. And some of these fierce genetic Viking types, after getting out of the military, volunteer and go back. And many Kurds are converting to Christianity. Look at this.
More now in the battle against ISIS in Iraq, and that fight has actually been joined by American boots on the ground, although these Americans are volunteers, veterans, no longer taking their orders from the U.S. military. Our Bill Neely was with them as they fought with Kurdish forces on the front lines outside Erbil.
War with ISIS. Kurdish troops in a frontline battle with an enemy that took their land. They are taking it back. It began with coalition airstrikes, hitting ISIS in 3 villages. More than 100 Kurdish troops move in, with them a half-dozen Americans, veterans of the war in Iraq, back as volunteers. Some didn't want to be identified.
The next village?
Next village.
Okay.
They target the black ISIS flag and a 4th village. As they move in, a Humvee spots 3 suspected ISIS fighters running and gives chase. Later they reported 3 dead. The Kurds suffer casualties too, their lead Humvee hit by a hidden bomb. ISIS has booby-trapped roads and buildings, but the village appears secure. Then ISIS hits back.
The Kurds have taken that village, but there is gunfire now and a battle going on, and the Kurds have decided to make a retreat.
There is a frantic pullback. ISIS may have lost ground, but they're not beaten.
They're everywhere.
This is going to take time.
Yes, the enemy you don't fight today, you leave for your children. I can't have that.
They're just pure evil. Pure evil.
The Kurds found dozens of IEDs and ISIS tunnels. It's an enemy on the run, but ready to fight on. Bill Neely, NBC News, Waqta, Iraq.
If these things get loose, it's the end of humanity. Jesus said when he comes back, it's going to be as in the days of Noah.
Yes.
Well, what was going on in the days of Noah? In addition to the violence and the debauchery and the lewdness that was taking place in the world, the Nephilim were here, the offspring of the fallen angels who bred with human women, the Nephilim. We had giants in the land.
This story about the Nephilim is a folk tale that was told word of mouth from generation to generation long before there was a written language. I had the good fortune to meet Bruno Bettelheim on his retirement round of lectures. Bruno was a survivor of a Nazi concentration camp and became a professor of psychiatry or psychology and education, and had a live-in home for autistic children funded by the Ford Foundation in Chicago. But had much wisdom. He wrote a book on folk tales in the Middle East there. And when he spoke at the University of Buffalo at the question and answer period, I asked him, "Are you Jewish?" And he says, "Well, I'm not religious, but I am Jewish, and I have respect for the Jewish Bible, because when I researched folk tales around the Middle East, those stories that are in the Jewish Old Testament were common stories that the elders would tell. That was before the written language, and they would sit around and the elders would pass on the wisdom to their children and grandchildren. And the stories were for helping them, and they were similar, he said, all over. Stories like the jealous brother and things about what got people in trouble and destroyed families so that their children and grandchildren would know. At any rate, this Nephilim story, it may very well be they're talking about the Vikings. Vikings were Norse, were hunting woolly mammoths and working in groups all across America. There's evidence of it until the woolly mammoths were exterminated and they immigrated back to Europe. But they were sailing the ocean. They left their megaliths everywhere, and there's stories of them around where they sailed, and that's a whole nother thing. But at any rate, these Northern Europeans that were so strong and worked together in hunting woolly mammoths and sailed and were so hard to defeat in battle. This is probably the origin of this folk tale of the Nephilim, and that genetics is still there. But now they degraded into calling them skinheads and stuff like that, and they don't have a father to give them the proper training or a culture where they're working together with a team for hunting or fighting. But there's some good ones, and there's a strong genetics there, so wake up.
More now on the battle against ISIS in Iraq, and that fight has actually been joined by American boots on the ground, although these Americans are volunteers, veterans, no longer taking their orders from the U.S. military. Our Bill Neely was with them as they fought with Kurdish forces on the front lines outside Erbil.
War with ISIS. Kurdish troops in a frontline battle with an enemy that took their land. They are taking it back. It began with coalition airstrikes, hitting ISIS in 3 villages. More than 100 Kurdish troops move in, with them a half-dozen Americans, veterans of the war in Iraq, back as volunteers. Some didn't want to be identified.
The next village? Next village. Okay.
They target the black ISIS flag and a 4th village. As they move in, a Humvee spots 3 suspected ISIS fighters running and gives chase. Later they reported 3 dead. The Kurds suffer casualties too, their lead Humvee hit by a hidden bomb. ISIS has booby-trapped roads and buildings. But the village appears secure. Then ISIS hits back.
The Kurds have taken that village, but there is gunfire now and a battle going on. And the Kurds have decided to make a retreat.
There is a frantic pullback. ISIS may have lost ground, but they're not beaten.
They're everywhere.
This is going to take time.
Yes. The enemy, you don't fight today, you leave for your children. I can't have that.
They're just pure evil. Pure evil.
The Kurds found dozens of IEDs and ISIS tunnels. It's an enemy on the run, but ready to fight on. Bill Neely, NBC News, Waqta, Iraq.
These fierce fighting Christian Americans have left their mark and their lives are bearing fruit. Look at this.
This worship service in Iraqi Kurdistan is one example of the biblical revolution going on throughout the Middle East.
The Bible makes us feel like the book of Acts will be repeated here in Kurdistan.
These believers live in the predominantly Kurdish area of Iraq. Due to their culture and upbringing, they're often referred to as Muslim background believers. This church in Erbil, the capital of Kurdistan, called the Kurdsman Church, has been officially sanctioned by the government since 2004. The Kurdsman Church represents an historic breakthrough in church history. It's the first Kurdish church in 1400 years.
This is the first time for the Kurdish people that they have a church, and sometimes when the non-believers they are coming to the church, they see that we are worshiping and singing and shouting and teaching in the Kurdish language, they will be surprised.
Most of the believers in Iraqi Kurdistan are former Muslims. In Suleymaniye, this entire group of worshippers are former Muslims, including their pastor, a former Muslim cleric.
I was one of those before I came to believe the message that I should kill the others. Sometimes I wanted to kill my wife because she did not cover her hair. But when I found my life in Jesus, Matthew 5 tells me to love my enemies.
Others throughout Iraqi Kurdistan have also been transformed.
I'm very happy that Jesus came and knocked on the door of my heart, and that I got to know the real God in a real way of life.
Before becoming a believer, I always felt there was something missing in my life, as if I had lost something. That feeling was constantly with me. Now, as I am a believer, that feeling is gone. I know that I have found what was missing in my life.
In Iran and in Syria and Jordan and Iraq and Afghanistan, great things are happening as many Muslims are open to the Lord Jesus Christ right now.
Tom Doyle works with Muslims throughout the Middle East and says the church's potential for growth is amazing.
Just in 4 countries we work in, they're projecting 500 new churches just in Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. In Iran, the ministries that work together are projecting 10,000 new churches in Iran next year. That's how fast they're opening up to the gospel.
Turkey is another Middle Eastern country where more Muslims are coming to faith in Jesus. This believer says many Muslims come to church after seeing a vision or having a dream.
The people saw some vision about Jesus. Even they not read Bible. Even they don't know about anything about New Testament, about the church. They just see Jesus in their dream.
This phenomenon occurs throughout the Middle East, as it did with Pastor Zagros.
I saw Jesus another time in my dream in 1999. He didn't leave me alone. He came to me again. He said, I love you and I want you to be saved.
So how can believers around the world join in this spiritual revolution? Leaders here say the answer is prayer.
The most important thing the leadership tells us here in the Middle East, and we shouldn't be surprised to this, is that as the prayer teams grow around the world for them, the work just takes off. The more that people pray for God's Spirit to rest on these young men and women to share the gospel, the more He just furthers the kingdom of God.
And the message coming from these believers is the 2,000-year-old message of the gospel.
I want to tell the world, accept the love of God. It will be today or in the future. They have to kneel to God. It's better to do it right now.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Iraqi Kurdistan.
The reality I see here is the dream of a better world by people who have a good foundation. By that I mean in that Muslim world there, more than in America today, the babies are breastfed and the mothers in the home, and they receive the love and the caring and the jogging around, that their brain and their spirit, their outlook develops, that they are able to love themselves and love others like themselves and love their mother and father and their source of existence from God, whose dirt they're created. That's so simple when you come down to it. But if you raise a child like a kitten taken away from its mother too soon. It doesn't know how to be a mother, and it's not very friendly. How to make a barnyard dog that'll bite anybody that comes by. Not by giving them a loving mother. Wake up. It's the home, and nothing replaces the mother. The research shows the baby at birth knows the mother's voice from inside the womb. Another woman saying the same thing causes stress in the baby. It wants the mother's voice, and it needs that bump, a bump, a bump from the heartbeat and the walking, and rather than stuck in a baby carriage where they can't see out, no stimulation, while nerve growth factor is present that their neurons could grow, and you wouldn't have to worry about autism. Get with it. Excuse me, but I'm angry at the way children are deprived in Europe and America. I'm here in Russia, and they're doing a better job. I've seen such good changes in 20 years. There are more mothers breastfeeding, carrying their babies, and in the home. And another thing about Russia, my talking about the Koran and showing that it's a murder cult. Yes, I've had death threats. It wasn't long after there were those murders of the Boston Marathon where the Chechens murdered a bunch of people. And the FSB had told the FBI about those murder cult people that said we're punished in Russia, and they were given asylum in America so they could carry out that murder cult there. And that FSB, the Federal Security Service here, called the FBI and told them about these Chechens, and they did nothing. So when I had these death threats, I called the FSB. They monitor my work on the YouTube, my work on the website. Maybe it's goofy, and maybe I'll get killed, but I am so glad I could produce this film. I hope it bears fruit for the spirit of truth, the outlook of the truth. Wake up and learn more of the reality in which you live and move and have your being. Thank you.
And God said he regretted making the human race because everything had been polluted.
Everything.
And only Noah was pure. I believe it referred to his DNA. He was the only human, his family, they were the only ones left who their DNA had not been polluted with Nephilim DNA. God said, I got to kill it. I got to stop it. I got to start over. I got to hit the reset button. My friend, we're at the days of Noah. God is about to say, enough is enough. The human race has got to end. I'm bringing my children home, and that's it. You better get saved now. Jesus Christ is coming.